Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie Ostwalt, and I'm honored this week to be joined by author and educator Dr. Dana Powell. Dr. Powell is a member of the Department of Anthropology and published her 2017 book, Landscapes of Power, with Duke University Press. Dana has been named faculty member of distinction in the College of Arts and Sciences for her work with the protests involving the Dakota Access Pipeline. Welcome, Dr. Powell, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
I have your book here. It's hot off the press, right?
It is.
Came out in January, just a couple of months ago. Had a chance to read it over the last couple of days. It's excellent work. Thank you for your contribution. Landscapes of Power, Politics of Energy in the Navajo Nation. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got interested in working with the Navajo Nation and what this book entails, just briefly?
It's a bit of a long story, but I'll reach back to a few years after I finished a degree in religious studies at Guilford College, a small Quaker school in Greensboro. I was working in Atlanta first with feminist organizing NGOs and grassroots groups, and then from that took a job working with the music duo Indigo Girls, who are based in Atlanta. And for folks a whole lot younger than me who might be watching, they may not know of this group, but you can look them up.
Oh, I know this group. It's so interesting that you're
they're
working
great.
with them. Yeah.
They really are a model of activist musicians who signed a 20-record deal with Epic Sony Records in 1988. No one would ever do that anymore, but have produced a huge volume of creative work, but at the same time have made a career in being allies with a number of movements, including the movement that we might call indigenous environmental justice in the U.S. So I was working with them as a political organizer and handling a lot of their writing and research and media outreach, and so got involved really on the ground with a number of struggles within Native nations that were related to toxicity, environmental contamination, legacies of uranium mining, legacies of coal extraction, and just started to get interested in what was going on. So that led me to do doctoral work in that area.
So the Indigo Girls led you and pushed you toward Ph.D. work in anthropology. That's fascinating.
They did.
So our viewers might wonder, this is a program on religion, yet we're talking about the politics of environmentalism. So, and it's odd when we talk about indigenous cultures, Native American cultures in particular, because the concept of religion is something that's not quite in sync with the cultural worldview of indigenous groups. So what's the connection here between this program on religion and your work with environmental politics?
Well, I think the connection is that environmental politics, or what a lot of the Diné or Navajo folks that I work with might call it sovereignty work, or might call it ethical work, that it's about a politics of reclaiming certain ways of being healthy, reclaiming certain livelihoods and lifeways that is not necessarily returned to the past. I don't mean it in that kind of nostalgic sense, but Native nations in the U.S. have really borne the brunt of extractive industry, largely, as well as other sort of patterns of economic underdevelopment, which has been part of the ongoing process of settler colonialism. And so environmental politics in Native nations looks very different than it looks in non-Native or beyond the reservation kinds of spaces. So that religion, if religion is about certain modalities of faith and belief and thinking in terms of broader cosmologies, that is very much at work in environmental activism within Navajo Nation.
And environmental activism is seen as this kind of ethical mandate, in a sense.
For sure. I mean, I want to be very clear that the Navajo Nation and Diné people, of which there are close to about 300,000 enrolled members of the Navajo Nation, and about 200,000 of those reside on the Navajo Reservation, which is in the Four Corners area of the U.S. Southwest. But there's another 75,000, 100,000 who live in LA and New York City and wherever. It's the sort of wider diaspora
Right.
of Dene people, as you would find with any indigenous people today, that this is an incredibly diverse, internally diverse group of people who, in some cases, religion might look like Mormonism or evangelical, or an evangelical tradition, or other modalities of Christianity. There's a very strong Catholic community, which is linked to the Catholic missionaries. And the St. Michael's community in near Window Rock, Arizona. There's a very old, very strong Catholic church where services are conducted in the Navajo language. So that's part of what is going on. At the same time, there are a number of people that practice what folks would see as more indigenous religions, and that might be Native American church, which is pan-indigenous, or it might be what Navajo people call the corn pollen way.
And this is Dene culture. This is spirituality that is ancient. It's tied to the land and so forth. So we really, I mean, this is very complex, right? So if we talk about the Navajo Nation, we're talking about indigenous religion, we're talking about people who are evangelicals, Catholics, atheists, secularists.
Sure.
So we really can't talk about Navajo religion.
You can only speak of it in the plurality.
In the
we can
religions,
speak of Navajo religions, for sure, of Navajo religions, and that they're, the rise of evangelical movements has been quite recent,
right?
Last 20 years or so, but it's very strong on Navajo Nation. At the same time, there's a kind of renaissance of interest in what people would see as traditional Navajo religion, or people might call it corn pollen way, or ceremony. People who conduct ceremony.
Ceremonies, rituals, the sorts of things we normally identify with religion, but here might be identified more with a spirituality or a worldview or even a philosophy of life. Is that a good way of putting
I would put it in two ways. I mean, as a philosophy of life, or what Dene people would call Dene fundamental law, which is a philosophy of life described as Sa'anagai B'Kehojon, which is the Dene way of describing that philosophy, which is a philosophy of how to live. It's an ethical mandate. It's about how to relate to other beings, human and non-human, how to conduct yourself in relationships, how to think about the course of your own life. And so there's a whole very complex philosophy, which informs the way people make decisions about what should be done. At the same time, ceremony is also medicine in Navajo philosophy and in Navajo tradition. So ceremony is, in some ways, very different than what we might think of ceremony, or what we might think of as ceremony and ritual in religions of the Western tradition.
Is there a type of, I don't know, could you imagine someone following the corn pollen way and also become an evangelical Christian and have a kind of amalgamation of traditions? Is there any sort of religious complexity in that sense, or does one jettison one way in favor of another, or is it both, perhaps?
I think you see both. I am not an expert in evangelicalism, but what I understand from talking with a lot of Navajo evangelicals is that there is something of a mandate to foreclose or break from ceremony and those kinds of ceremonial or traditional or customary knowledges. And that can be very painful, I think, within families, within communities. There is a sense among many Dene people that those ways of knowing, those ways of being, those philosophies are endangered and are at risk and need to be taught to new generations and need to be taught in the Navajo language to new generations. And so I think there's a real debate and a real discussion going on within Navajo culture, if you want to put it that way, about the role of evangelical religion, which on the one hand empowers and organizes and kind of breathes sort of life into what at times is a very sort of challenging set of conditions on the reservation, but also can ask people to foreclose or to break from those traditional or customary knowledges which are themselves at risk.
And that's, of course, been part of the history of colonialism, with European Christianity coming in and I guess endangering native traditions and cultural traditions. Now, you had mentioned to me earlier that Pentecostalism is fast growing among Navajo nations, and I find that interesting because Pentecostalism is one of the fastest growing, if not the fastest growing type of Christian expression worldwide now, and is often found in developing countries, making vast inroads. So do you think there's something about indigenous culture that gravitates toward Pentecostalism, which is open to spiritual ecstasy, which is open to empowerment from transcendent sources? What, if anything, is going on there, do you think?
It's a great question. I wish I could speak to that with some authority, but I really feel like that's a question that they're great scholars. Kirk Dombrowski, who does research in Native Alaska on Pentecostalism in Native Alaska, Kimberly Marshall, who does research in the Navajo Nation on Pentecostalism in the Navajo Nation, might be able to speak to that. I mean, my kind of sense of what's going on is that there may be an openness to that. At the same time, there's a huge risk as well, because as you mentioned, the legacies of colonialism, which are not just in the past, but they are part of the present,
Right.
Have created the conditions for a lot of people to return to this sense of Navajo corn pollen way, or a sense of traditional practice or customary religious practice as a political act, right? As a political act in the face of an ever increasing incursion of settler logics and colonial ways of thinking and being.
Right.
So.
And you mentioned earlier that the younger generation may not be gravitating towards some of the older ways, some of the corn pollen ceremonies. So I guess you've got this kind of conflict, intergenerational conflict, going on as well within communities.
I actually think younger generations are gravitating towards it. Particularly, we're seeing something very exciting happening right now in the Southwest and on the Navajo Nation, which is a real surge of young people making a conscious decision to remain or return to the reservation to make a life there.
Okay.
Even in a context where there's not a lot of economic kind of opportunity, people are interested in learning how to herd sheep as their grandparents did, or in learning how to tend gardens, or just wanting to be close to people who speak Navajo as a first language.
Right.
So I think there is a return, and there's a kind of renaissance and a return. Part of the problem is linguistic. It's a lot of the knowledge of corn pollen way and Navajo ceremony needs to be known, performed, transmitted in Diné Bizad, in the Diné language.
Gotcha.
Not in English.
And that's an obstacle.
It's an obstacle.
Let's talk about your book specifically a little bit. So there's a lot going on here, but I think kind of the fundamental conflict here is what happens when, in this case, Navajo lands are rich with resources.
Yeah.
Right? And people want to extract those resources, and so this sets up a kind of political conflict. But one of the things that strikes me is that, at least in part, Navajo culture, philosophy of life, worldview, values the sense of landscape and place, and creates a sense of landscape as sacred. And that, in some way, is energizing this conflict and debate. Am I reading that correctly?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Can you maybe articulate a little bit better than I have what it means to have a kind of sacred sense of landscape or place, and how that fundamentally directs one's sense of how you treat the world around you?
There's a very different relationship to land and to place in Navajo Nation, and that's a historical relationship. It has to do with long land tenure, a long time of being in a particular place, even with the kinds of movements, removals, and returns that Navajo people have experienced. Really significant to this sense of sacred place there is that between 1864 and 1868, Diné people were rounded up and forcibly marched to an internment camp near current-day Albuquerque, New Mexico, held for 4 years, and were able to negotiate on June 1st, 1868. This is the 150th year of that treaty, a treaty to return home to the land between their four sacred mountains. That defines in many ways this Dene sensibility about the sacredness of what's called Dene Bakea, or the Dene homeland.
Right.
So even, and I think this is really important, even when you find, as you do, Dene people on many different sides of the debate about natural resource extraction. You have plenty of Dene people who are pro-coal, who are interested in natural resource extraction at the level of tribal government, people who are against it. They're very diverse positions on what should be done about natural resource extraction. Everyone agrees that that homeland is a sacred place as defined by the four directions which correspond to four sacred mountains, which correspond to four sacred colors, four stones, particular deities.
Right.
There is an agreement about that. Another really important, I think, piece of your question about sacred landscapes in indigenous landscapes is the way that landscapes are storied in a way that is very deep. So for example, the supreme deity in Navajo cosmology is Changing Woman. And Changing Woman gave birth to twins, to the Hero twins, and they were born on a very particular mountain. It's an internal mountain within the Navajo reservation, which one can visit. You can go there. There's a sense in which the things that give the place meaning and give people a narrative of where they come from are attached to particular landscapes, which are visible in 2018.
Right.
So when those landscapes are under threat from either intensive extraction, uranium, coal, fracking, oil, gas, or as what happened in the western sacred mountain, which is close to Flagstaff, Arizona, the city of Flagstaff wanted to build a ski slope, a ski run with dirty city effluent water on an area that is considered a sacred site by both the Hopi and the Navajo.
Right.
This led to a huge issue about the ability for people to continue to pray and continue to interact with a landscape that has been sacred for quite some time, while the city was also making a claim to that same mountain.
Yeah.
So sacred landscapes have to do with practice, what people do, and have to do with stories, what people know, that tell people who they are in the present.
Yeah. So this sense of sacred landscape, I mean, it's really a lot more about preserving the scenery for tourists. It's about a lot more than creating toxic waste. There's something fundamentally more ingrained in Dene culture and Dene mindset and worldview here that's at stake.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. And it's related to, it's absolutely not just about a pretty picture, Monument Valley, you know, these kind of iconic landscapes. And I think this is important for me to underscore. This can be very confusing, I think, for folks from the outside, sort of this settler gaze that knows the Southwest as this iconic, majestic American landscape. It's Monument Valley, it's the Grand Canyon, but the histories that are in those canyons, right, that are retold through oral histories that have partially been written, the stories of Canyon de Chelly, for example, as the places where the Navajo, and some of these stories are not so old, the places where Navajo hid out in the 1860s when their peach trees were being burned down by the U.S. cavalry and they were being hunted down to be rounded up.
Right.
If you understand the legacy of that canyon, then you understand that it's different to people who occupy it today.
It's almost as if the Navajo people are speaking a different language from people who are trying to preserve the landscape but yet want to extract resources from that. I know in your book you said that at least some Navajo people reject the label of environmentalists. They don't see themselves as environmentalists. These are people coming from outside with a completely different view of the land and how the land should be used.
Well, I think there are many Dene activists who are interested in protecting the integrity of the landscape and in preserving and protecting the sacred landscapes that are happy to ally with outside environmentalists. And that's a very strategic alliance, right? When that strategic alliance can be made with powerful non-native environmental NGOs, there's incredible legal work that can be done, for example, and broader kinds of organizing beyond the reservation. But one thing that I have found in over 10 years of working in Navajo Nation and working with people who might be perceived as environmentalists, is that at stake are matters of sovereignty, not just juridical sovereignty, not just this nation-to-nation relationship with the United States government, but a sense of exerting a kind of autonomy, dignity, and integrity within one's place that is really at stake. And that's not quite the same as mainstream environmentalism. And people have really worked hard to identify and articulate a different kind of ethic. That's what I try to write about in the book.
Well, and your book, and this work has taken you beyond your work with the Navajo Nation that you chronicle in the book. You've also done some important work in the Dakotas, and you were recognized for that work by our own College of Arts and Sciences. You want to talk a little bit about the work you've done with the Dakota Pipeline, perhaps?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I only went there because I was invited by my Dene colleagues. And I think that's important for me to underscore, because I really saw the work at Standing Rock, at the Standing Rock Sioux, it's unceded territory that is adjacent to the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota, where the Dakota Access Pipeline was being laid. This was unfolding from April 2016 until February of 2017, and a call went out from the tribal leadership there at Standing Rock for allies to gather, native and non-native, to gather and join this sort of spreading camp. There were really 3 camps: Sacred Stone Camp, Rosebud Camp, and Ochedi-Chacoan Camp, this kind of main camp, which were not occupation camps because they were camps that were on land that was never legally ceded to the United States government, that was Sioux land by treaty, but which the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was claiming for the expansion of a 1,200-mile oil pipeline that would carry fracked oil from northern North Dakota to Illinois and onto the Gulf of Mexico. So I went by invitation of Dene friends and joined them there and went to write about what they were doing there, and learned a lot.
Yeah, and you were saying that part of the resistance movement there was based on a prayer camp, a kind of ecumenical place where people would come, and that it was a nonviolent kind of protest movement. And again, you can see sort of the remnants, I think, of a native spirituality and approach here in the way that protest was taken forth.
Indeed.
Yeah.
It was to me, a very modern, kind of postmodern sort of gathering. It was radically ecumenical. The Ochedi-Chacoan, Sacred Stone, Rosebud encampments were expressly prayer camps, meaning places in which direct action, political strategizing, and relationships among and between people should be carried out in a prayerful way. Now, what that means might look different, right, to different people.
Right.
What happened within the camp was that you had Buddhists, atheists, born-again Christians, some evangelicals, people who practice their traditional indigenous religions or practices from several hundred different native nations across the U.S. It was a very radically ecumenical kind of prayer camp. But the political strategy behind that, or the kind of ethical power of that, was that, not unlike Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement in some ways, that was a very disarming modality of direct action when it encounters heavily armed law enforcement at the front line. So it was quite powerful.
I bet so.
It was.
Your work is fascinating. I tell you, this is very interesting and important. And I encourage you to continue, because you're helping us to understand better this kind of difficult intersections between culture, religion, and politics. And you're helping those forces move forward. So thank you again. And thank you for coming on the show today.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Sure. And thank you for joining us on Religion and Life here at App TV. I want to thank again Dr. Dana Powell for taking time to be with us today, and ask you to join us next week when my guest will be Dr. Diana Pasulka, who will help us explore UFOs, extraterrestrials, and religion. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.